Chapter 607, Discovering an Abnormality. The window of the washroom was very high, preventing sufficient sunlight from shining in. It could only barely dispel the darkness, making everything seem gloomy. Klein moved the die of probability in his right hand to the all-black eye, and suddenly, it shook. Then, he threw the item into the other side of the wash basin. The milky white die rolled a few times before finally stopping, with 4 red dots pointing up. Klein held back his unobvious smile and took a step to the side and picked up the die of probability again. He lowered his head and said in a gentlemanly manner, "You don't wish to listen to it. Let's do this, give me an answer." 6 represents cooperation, while everything else represents a rejection. With that said, he threw the die of probability up and reached out to catch it. The milky white die fell straight down and rapidly rolled, showing 6 red dots. "Very good," Klein praised with a chuckle. After throwing the all-black eye back above the gray fog, he turned to open the door to the washroom and slowly walked to the living room. Under Darkwill's and Harry's gaze, which was filled with anticipation, worry, curiosity, and puzzlement, he suddenly stopped and threw the die of probability out. "No. No." Darkwill and the owl cried out at the same time, afraid that a score of 3 points and below would happen. The latter subconsciously flew up to distance itself from the fatty who might be struck by lightning. With a crisp tinkle, the milky white die rolled on the coffee table several times before fixing itself at 2 points. Just as the color in Darkwill's face drained, the die languidly rolled and fixed itself on 4. For the next 12 hours, it will be relatively quiet. Klein calmly sat down and began enjoying his breakfast, which had long turned cold. He really had a solution. Darkwill lowered his body and stared at the strange die on the coffee table. After nearly a minute, he couldn't help but extend his hand and throw the die, managing to roll a 6. Just as his palm left, the die moved by itself to 4. How magical! What method did J.M. Sparrow actually use? Did he really shit and soak the die inside? Ugh. Darkwill decided to accept the outcome and stopped thinking of the reason. Otherwise, he suspected that he would end up vomiting. Looking up at J.M. Sparrow, who was calmly spreading butter on his bread, Darkwill suddenly felt that with just a promise and 1,000 pounds to hire a bodyguard at this level was extremely worth it. He can definitely be ranked at the same level as any pirate admiral. If a tycoon were to encounter a situation like mine, they wouldn't hesitate to hire him with half their wealth. Thankfully, I only paid 300 pounds. The rest will be borne by teacher and the others. Darkwill felt relieved when he realized that he didn't need to worry about the die's random rolling for the next 12 hours. He couldn't help but stand up and stretch his back. He walked to the window and opened the tightly shut window to see the sparse clouds scattered across the clear skies. The endless azure blue sky stirred as it reflected the bright sunlight like it had countless golden fragments scattered in it. This energized Darkwill as he felt a burden be lifted from his chest. Unlike Backland, which would only become warm at the end of February, the Rorsted archipelago was no longer plagued by the cold. Life had returned to this area, facing the sea and the blooming of flowers in warm spring. Klein, who had finished his bread, walked to a spot behind Darkwill and felt like he was an animal who had awoken from hibernation. He didn't recite the poem that flashed past his mind, as firstly, it didn't suit J.M. Sparrow's persona, and secondly, it would probably make Darkwill reflect over Emperor Roselle's poetic talent. Until the evening, the die still didn't roll, but the weather had changed. Strong winds howled as dark clouds gathered. A storm was brewing. This was the most common danger at sea. Even if one took a safe sea route which had been traversed by others, one would occasionally encounter similar situations. It just wasn't as terrifying. Klein looked at the tall waves and the dark sky, and he felt as though the ship was cruising through a mountain valley. By the sides were tall dark blue cliffs that could topple down at any moment. The intense pressure made a mid-sequence beyonder like him feel repressed. He even wished to pray to God, hoping that the liner would cruise through the storm safely. It's no wonder sailors, pirates, and merchants who live on the sea for extended periods of time can't help but respect the Lord of Storms. They would more or less believe in him. Klein sighed in silence. Although he didn't believe the storm that wasn't that powerful could bury a liner which was powered by both sails and steam engines, he still attached caution to the matter by praying to his alternate identity, sea god Calvatua. He was afraid that the die of probability would suddenly go crazy during the storm and roll a one, causing the ship to sink to the bottom of the sea. Therefore, he decided to make preemptive precautions. Klein did believe Snake of Fate will Ossipton's judgment that the die of probability would be quiet for 12 hours after the first intimidation act, but this was without any additional conditions. He believed that it was more likely that a sealed artifact with living characteristics would deal with situations like a person instead of rules. Hence, he had to take precautions for any troubles it might cause. Stealing a glance at Darkwill and the owl, who were looking somewhat uneasy due to the storm, Klein calmly said, "I'll take a nap. Continue watching the die, take turns and do not relax." "All right." Watching Jayam and Sparrow enter the master bedroom, Darkwill walked to the side of the coffee table and sat down. As he stared at the die, he asked Harry, "What thoughts do you have now?" Harry flew around and mumbled, "Why am I not a petrel?" In the master bedroom, Klein went above the gray fog and summoned the sea god scepter from the junk pile. He held the scepter with blue gems embedded at the top and quickly replied to his prayer. Klein didn't expend too much of his spirituality to calm the storm. This was firstly because they weren't too far from the surrounding seas of the Rorstad archipelago. Such an obvious and exaggerated supernatural phenomenon was easily able to attract the attention of Sea King John Cotman, who shared the same domain, or the storm priests on the ships. Secondly, he had to conserve strength to deal with the die of probability. What he did was simple. He augmented the ship with layers of beyonder effects, allowing it to cruise through the storm stably without any risk of capsizing. Towards a sequence 5 or 6 beyonder below the rank of demigod, to do something similar to a liner which had hundreds of people on board required plenty of preparations and a complicated ritual. It was only possible by exhausting them, but to a sea god of this domain, it was all simple and easy. A demigod already has inklings of a god. Klein sighed and threw the scepter back into the junk pile, before silently disappearing from above the gray fog. In the time that followed, the ship bobbed up and down like a leaf in the wind. But no matter how terrifying or towering the dark blue waves were, nothing happened to it until the end of the storm. At 4 p.m. on Thursday, Backland, Williams Street. For's Wall once again arrived here by carriage. She didn't sit in the coffee shop again. Instead, she strolled down the street and observed the pedestrians and surrounding buildings. She also took note of figures with special traits as material for her novel. There really are a lot of foreigners. They're still mainly from Fasak and Intis. Heh heh, one of them is a barbaric and stocky white bear, while the other is a colorful, ostentatious rooster. Fors chuckled silently to herself. At this moment, she came to the middle of Williams Street, where there was an abandoned chapel. Withered vines crawled over its walls, and gray stones were strewn everywhere. With the intention to not waste Mr. World's payment, Fors deliberately approached it to check for any abnormalities. She circled around the chapel without discovering anything. Following that, she entered and avoided the disgusting shit and rotten things, and she quickly observed every corner. Suddenly, her gaze came to a stop as she frowned bit by bit. In a particular corner of the half-collapsed ruin, the ground had been dug up by someone. The pit wasn't too big or deep, and there were remnant traces of it being dug with fingers. This should be considered an abnormality, right? Fors cautiously retreated and didn't do a detailed investigation. After walking through all of Williams Street, she immediately returned home and organized the abnormality and material she jotted down together. She then sacrificed it to Mr. Fool and asked him to hand it over to the world. Fors didn't conceal anything she saw, even if they didn't seem to have any superficial problems. This was because she knew very well that any abnormality would be judged by the world, and not by herself, who didn't understand the situation. In the ancient palace above the fog, Klein immediately began reading the report Miss Magician had submitted. That abandoned chapel has signs of being dug up. The previous digging attempts had been dealt with by me and Miss Sharon. Who would dig it up again? Rafter Pound, that descendant of the Tudor family, he nearly died from the evil spirit's possession. Without any helpers, it's unlikely he would take further risks. Who could it be? Klein thought for a moment, but he couldn't lock onto a suspect. All he could do was continue reading. While he read the notes written in a beautiful language, he acutely noticed a point. There are many foreigners on the street. They are mainly from Fasac and Intis. It wasn't like that back when I went to William Street. Did a Fasac or Intis company recently open there? Fasac Intis. Klein ruminated over the two countries' names when he suddenly recalled something. The royal family of the Fasac Einhorn, the Einhorn family, and Intis, former royal family, the Sauron family, are both in control of the Hunter pathway, which is also the Red Priest pathway. It was two of the blood types which the evil spirit had designated as being capable of removing the seal. Together with the Medici family's descendants, which had been destroyed at Banzi Harbor, the three factions which held control over the Red Priest pathway are involved. Banzi Harbor was destroyed, causing the Medici family's Beyonder characteristic to use some magical connection to contact the evil spirit who's suspected to be Red Angel. Hence, the members of the Einhorn and Sauron families were attracted. No, that's not realistic. If the Church of Storms didn't discover any Beyonder characteristics, they definitely would have noticed a problem in this. Another reason? The evil spirit is using another method to attract people from the Einhorn and Sauron families. What or who did it go through in order to do so? The number of people who know of the evil spirit's existence is only a handful, me, Miss Sharon, as well as. Amidst his racing thoughts, Klein suddenly thought of a possibility. It was Rafter Pound, the descendant of the Tudor family who had previously been possessed by the evil spirit. He had unknowingly become a slave of the evil spirit. He had secretly helped it spread the news. And the evil spirit had sought me and Miss Sharon's help to numb us into thinking that we are the only ones who can rescue it. For this, it didn't mind betraying its descendants. Klein was alarmed as he felt like he had been fooled by the evil spirit.